Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 106 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This episode is for all you young, aspiring professionals looking to make a difference in the world. Today, we are going to introduce you to a newer area of study, potentially a future vocation for some of you. I am referring to the topic of neurocriminology. Actually, though, this should also be of interest to current helping professionals in the field as well. I can tell you that one thing that I have consistently struggled with or have had to address as an evidence-based practice trainer is the fact that we are working in the social sciences, or the so-called soft sciences, as opposed to the hard sciences. It does make it more difficult to persuade somebody based on social sciences versus hard science data, in my opinion. Well, today we are joined once again by our good friend, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University, who is going to introduce us to the topic of neurocriminology. I love learning about anything which enlightens us to the hardwiring, if you will, as to how the human brain works, particularly in relationship to behaviors. In this case, criminal behaviors. Today, Dr. Brown is going to, first off, simply define neurocriminology for the audience, and then hopefully you'll see how this really dovetails with the themes of this podcast, in which I consistently maintain we need to take a more holistic view of our clients and embrace more of an all-of-the-above approach. So whether you are currently working under the risk-need responsivity framework or under the desistance approaches we love talking about on this program, I think you're really going to benefit from this episode. We are going to learn all about the various topics which fall under the neurocriminology umbrella, up to and including cognitive behavioral interventions and the interplay with neurocriminology. So again, if you operate under the risk-need responsivity framework, you know all about responsivity, in particular general responsivity, which says we really need to embrace those cognitive behavioral interventions. And again, knowing about neurocriminology is going to give you all a much deeper understanding of the effectiveness of those interventions, impediments to those interventions, and things you can do to augment those interventions. So you're going to want to listen in particular for that. I love having Dr. Brown on the show. I always learn so much from him. With no further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Brown, here to talk with us today about another fascinating topic. I love having you on the program because, as I've talked about, I'm a lifelong learner and I learn something every time you come on the show. Today, we're going to be talking all about neurocriminology. But again, before we do that, I know you've been a friend of the show, Jerrod. Why don't you give us a little bit of an introduction for first-time listeners, and then we'll get right to the topic du jour.
You bet. Thank you, Joe, for having me back, my good friend. So hope all of you are doing well. My name's Jerrod. I am a professor, trainer, consultant, and researcher. Love giving trainings on a lot of these topics we talk about. I teach a lot of different classes on a variety of these kinds of topics, write quite a few articles, publish, do a lot of consultation with various organizations and professionals and even family members related to probably my main areas of focus are the forensic aspects of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, traumatic brain injury, autism. I do some work in the area of suggestibility and confabulation and youth fire setting. And what we're talking about today in neurocriminology, really fascinated in this topic and have just been taking more of a deeper dive into this world more and more all the time. A lot of the things I do are, I would say, come very close to falling under the umbrella of neurocriminology or butting up very closely to it. And hopefully after we have a discussion today, all of your audience is motivated to really learn about this topic on a much deeper level, because I am convinced if you can understand these topics that we're going to talk about today, we're going to have a much better understanding of human behavior.
I myself am already intrigued just by the topic today, neurocriminology. Why don't we start out, Jerrod? Tell us what neurocriminology is. And again, I know we're going to do a deep dive, but maybe just give us that 30,000 feet definition at first. Neurocriminology.
Well, we all know what criminology is, obviously the study of crime, and we start throwing in neuro in there. We're looking at the brain, of course, but really neurocriminology is going to be encompassing research related to genetics and physiology and neuroimaging and biochemistry. But we can't forget, obviously, it's so important to understand the family dynamics, environmental factors, social factors, how drug use plays into this, how trauma, attachment. Some of this literature calls it maybe like biosocial criminology. So it's really looking at the neurobiological kind of underpinnings that may partially contribute to criminal behavior. So if we were to break this apart even further, we're looking at neuroscience research. We're looking at biology, sometimes neurochemistry that is wrapped up into here, and then obviously infusing that with criminology. So looking at the study of crime through these different lenses. And by doing this, if folks are wanting to learn a lot more about the world of neurocriminology, obviously it is complex, requires lots of studying on various topics, trainings, education. But neurocriminologists, folks who do this kind of work, and I am not saying I'm a neurocriminologist. I am definitely wanting to be at some point, but I definitely nowhere close yet. But I really encourage people, when you think of this, studying the brains of people who commit crimes. What is going on in their brain? Looking at different types of brain structures, the functioning of the brain. How does someone start engaging in antisocial behaviors? What are the factors that cause people to engage in these behaviors? People who do this kind of work obviously have a lot of knowledge in the area of psychopathy. So really looking at some of the underpinnings of psychopathy. But neurocriminology research also really looks at different things that can be used to help better understand and predict and treat and really prevent, hopefully, future criminal behavior from happening. So if you are, whatever field you're working in, if you can learn at least some of this information, you should be in a better position to understand why some people engage in just strange, unusual, irrational, violent, inappropriate types of behavior. Joe, I'll kick it back to you for any thoughts or questions, but I have a lot more definitely we can go into.
Well, I, for one, am going to go down the neurocriminology rabbit hole, Jerrod. I know I've been speaking to you and others about this for years, but my mantra is that we need to take a more holistic view of the clients that we serve, and we can't get so I don't want to say fixated, but so tied to one doctrine that we put on the blinders to others, because as you stated, that's just not how human beings and development works. So I'm always looking at, again, a more holistic approach. It's one of the reasons, for example, that I'm currently enrolled in your wonderful program at Concordia, learning all about trauma, resiliency, and self-care, because I realized we had to get out of the risk need responsivity bubble and expand and look more into that desistance bubble, and now perhaps even more into the neurocriminology bubble. Are there other topics that neurocriminologists examine besides those you've already mentioned, Jerrod?
Neurotransmitter dysfunction. I'm in the process of actually developing a training just on neurotransmitter dysfunction and its link to criminal behavior. Why do we care about that? Because serotonin, dopamine, GABA, the list goes on. We could spend all day on neurotransmitter dysfunction. But interestingly, if you want to understand this too, I truly recommend learning about the gut, digestive health issues, the gut-brain health axis. Most of our serotonin is actually produced in our gut. So if you're working with clients that have mood control issues, serious mental health problems, chronic drug and alcohol misuse, the research is very clear on this. They probably have a digestive health system that is not working at optimal levels. So when your gut is off, your mood is off, your thinking, your energy, it can have a huge impact on your skin health, on your brain health. It's so interconnected. Understanding the endocrine system, I'll talk a little bit about that. The main driver, the main component of the endocrine system is the HPA axis. You know all about this now, Joe. HPA axis is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. It's our main stress response system. I think if you want to study neurocriminology, it's imperative to understand the gut, in my opinion, the endocrine system, the nervous system, these neurotransmitters. It just really helps us better understand human behavior. Now, we know a lot of people who come into contact with the criminal justice system, particularly like long-term repeat offenders, individuals that have been in and out of the criminal justice system. The research really leans to the fact that brain dysfunction is going to be quite high among people that have long-term histories of criminal justice involvement, particularly violent offenders, sometimes sex offenders. When we think of brain dysfunction, obviously the first one that comes to mind is one of my main areas of expertise is traumatic brain injury. We know that at least half, if not more, of people in prison, according to the research, have had a history of brain injury. And if we start looking at female offender populations, that rate is higher. If we look at just a few of the studies that have been done on death row inmates, there's a few studies that have looked at death row inmates and traumatic brain injury. 2 studies I'm aware of. I believe one looked at juveniles and one looked at adults. These are old studies from decades past. Small sample sizes for both, but 100% of each participant pool for each study had a history of traumatic brain injury. So if you're working with extreme violent offenders, there's a high likelihood that they're dealing with some brain dysfunction. Most likely, I would say, probably in the frontal lobes, the executive function, but ruling out head injury history is going to be very, very helpful. But there's all kinds of other causes for brain dysfunction you just want to be aware of. Trauma in and of itself could cause brain dysfunction. So you have a child who's born and now is exposed to horrific forms of trauma early on in life. We know about the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, complex developmental trauma. That extensive trauma during those critical stages of development can cause brain dysfunction. It can cause neurochemical abnormalities. It can cause self-regulation issues. The list goes on. What happens if you've had clients with a history of strokes? That could be a brain dysfunction. Epilepsy. A colleague and I spent a lot of time on this many years ago. We dug into epilepsy and how it factors into the criminal justice world. I haven't spent a lot of time on epilepsy in the last few years, but there's actually several studies that have talked about epilepsy and the implications it can have for the criminal justice system. By no means am I saying people with a history of epilepsy seizure disorders are going to be more likely to commit crimes, but go online, go to Google Scholar, type in epilepsy or seizure disorders and the criminal justice system. You'll be shocked to learn how many studies have actually looked at that. What about neurocognitive disorders in and of themselves? So are there other types of brain-based problems going on? Maybe you're working with clients with a long history of drug or alcohol problems. I gave a talk a handful of years ago on the topic of Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome. That results from a B1 thiamine deficiency, most commonly caused by chronic alcohol use. Something to be on the lookout for. If you're working with people involved in the criminal justice system that have had decades-long problems with chronic alcohol use, long-term homelessness, malnutrition, long histories of like detox missions, things like that, be on the lookout. There might be something going on with their brain related to alcohol use. What about just long-term exposure to toxic stress? Or maybe someone grew up in poverty or homelessness and they were exposed to lead or mercury or any type of other neurotoxins, environmental toxins. I am in the process, Joe, too. This is a fascinating thing. I think maybe you disagree, but I'm putting together a little talk on air pollution exposure and its link to criminal behavior. There are so many studies that have been published on that. I was shocked to learn there is a link between air pollution exposure and criminal behavior in some cases. So definitely another topic to consider when we kind of look at this world of neurocriminology. And just general nutritional deficiencies, malnutrition. What about food insecurity? Food insecurity could be an adverse childhood experience in and of itself. Someone grows up and they don't know where they're getting their next meal from. And at least the work I do in this area, the research points to the fact people with long-term histories of homelessness and poverty, a lot of times they're going to have access to food that might not be good for them. Foods that are loaded with sugar, salts, carbs, processed foods. Just looking at some of that research too has a real negative impact on mood and behavior and cognition and so on. So I think if you're doing risk assessment work, pre-sentence investigations, if you're a competency to stand trial evaluator, if you're a police officer, just understanding investigative interviewing, Miranda rights warnings, if you're a corrections officer, if you could learn this stuff on a deep level, I think you're going to have a much better understanding of why people do the things they do and realize it's not black or white. There are so many gray areas and so many rabbit holes to go down. And most people, in my experience, it's not just one thing. It's not just the trauma. It's not just mental health. It's not just the drugs. It's not just growing up in a chaotic home environment. There's so many layers here. Nutritional factors. Even looking at the research on sleep disorders and criminal behavior or circadian rhythm misalignment. We could talk about that too, Joe. These are just a few things to consider in that world of just neurocriminology, biocriminology, just having a better understanding of human behavior in general.
I love how you framed that, Jerrod, excuse me. And that's also reflective of what I talk about on this program so much, is the fact that there are multiple pathways into criminality. And yes, we can look at the main pathways through, for example, the risk need responsivity model, but we really need to do our due diligence and look at all those pathways into crime and delinquency to best serve our clients and our stakeholders. So you mentioned something earlier which triggered a question in my head. A lot of what we do with evidence-based practices in corrections is anchored in cognitive behavioral interventions. So would a better understanding of neurocriminology help us better deliver those cognitive behavioral interventions and or perhaps understand some impediments to that?
I believe so, yes. If you look through a neuro, bio, psycho, social lens, you're going to be in a much better position to understand your people. What's going on with their brain? What's going on with their biochemistry? Are there neurotransmitter dysfunctions? Maybe there's omega-3 fatty acid deficiency. There's a whole line of research literature that talks about omega-3 fatty acid deficiency and a possible contributor to problematic behavior. There's some studies, they're small still. Most of the studies are pretty cautious to say that we can't generalize any of this yet because there's small sample sizes, but some studies have shown that providing omega-3 fatty acid supplementation to certain groups of people may reduce risk of aggression, irritability, and anger and violence in some cases. Everything I'm saying here, Joe, today is just educational purposes. So I encourage your audience, obviously consult with a qualified healthcare professional before even considering doing these things and making sure you have the proper training, credentials, education. But yeah, I think looking at their nutrition, looking at their sleep patterns. If you're trying to do CBT with someone who's chronically sleep deprived, their brain has a hard time probably processing information compared to someone who's well rested. Lots of things on sleep. If they're dealing with nutritional deficits, that can impact the way in which they present to you, and it could look like they might have a mental health disorder and get mislabeled with something maybe they don't have, when in fact, if they would have went to their doctor and maybe had some blood work and they figured out they're deficient in a lot of vitamins and minerals, could that better explain what's going on? It's tough to know. If people want to study this too, I would recommend looking at some of the research literature, maybe even seeking some training out on psychophysiology. Really think of psychophysiology as understanding kind of different physiological signals that the body and brain kind of record, and it relates to cognition and behavior and emotions, and really think of it as like biological underpinnings to help better explain behavior, human behavior. Some of the research being done through a neurocriminology lens and a psychophysiology lens is looking at heart rate variability and vagal tone, like polyvagal theory, and then skin conductance activity as well. So it's just fascinating research. And a lot of these things can be measured with certain types of equipment. So just having a better understanding of these things, I think you can really better understand human behavior. Your audience probably familiar with psychopathy and callous and unemotional traits that are just looking at some of that research. It's fascinating, and neurocriminologists study those kind of topics too and look at some of those psychophysiological kind of components that might better understand why they react the way they do. Part of that too, I think, obviously looking at different types of hormones that are being secreted in the system in response to stress. Cortisol being the main stress hormone. Sometimes high levels of cortisol could be detected, or very low levels of cortisol. Both can be problematic for different reasons. What about oxytocin? That's our bonding chemical. Some people call it the love hormone. It's related to attachment. It's regulated really by the hypothalamus. So the HPA axis has a lot to do with this. So attachment theory. On the surface, we probably understand attachment. But do we understand the role that trauma plays in it? Do we understand the role of oxytocin and cortisol and all these neurochemical hormones? It's a lot to ask people to study all of these things, and it takes a lot of time and energy. But I tell you, after learning about these things, it's really opened my eyes, and I have a lot more compassion for people, why they do the things. And it's also helped me understand maybe some of my behavioral reactions under certain situations. So I think it's not only going to help you professionally working with clients, but I think learning some of these things, you'll be more aware of health and wellness and burnout and just taking care of yourself so you're in the best position possible to live a very healthy life.
Yeah, I could not agree more with you. We're going to talk about, before I let you go, your programs at Concordia, of which I am currently enrolled. But to your point, Dr. Brown, I learned so much in that program, and I'm only in the second class now, which I wish I would have known about this when I started my career in corrections. And then also, to your point, just what I'm learning about my own self-care and well-being from this content is really just amazing. It sounds like we've we've scratched the surface here, but we could talk all day about this topic. If I have you back, I should say when I have you back to talk more about neurocriminology, and who knows, maybe there's some aspiring neurocriminologist out there in the audience. What would some future topics regarding neurocriminology be that we can sort of tease the audience that we'll come back and revisit at a future date?
Looking at some of the biological factors that the research points to that might be associated with antisocial behavior or juvenile delinquency would be one. I think looking at the role of prenatal trauma, prenatal care, or the lack thereof, and how some prenatal factors could set some people up on a trajectory for coming involved in the criminal justice system. So what was going on with mom during pregnancy, I think, has a lot to do with that as well. Looking maybe a little bit about intergenerational transmissions of trauma, epigenetics research comes to mind, being aware of allostatic load. I think it'd be fascinating to do a talk on just looking at some of the literature on air pollution exposure and what it says about the risk for criminal behavior in some cases. Maybe taking a deeper dive in the HPA axis or the autonomic nervous system, looking at community violence factors, social adversity, those kind of things, and even neighborhood disadvantage research would be very, very helpful as well. I think we could easily do one just on circadian misalignment, so really related to like that sleep-wake cycle. There's actually some literature that points to the fact that circadian rhythm misalignment could be a potential factor in some cases of aggressive behavior. Love to do one on oxytocin and attachment and how this links to that, and maybe even one on just poor nutritional habits early on in life or even prenatally and how that could be a potential factor for maybe more likelihood of coming into contact with the justice system. And another one, I mean, we could talk about iron deficiency. There's just research too. There's so many avenues to take. Iron deficiency early on in life has been found to be a risk factor for aggressive behavior in children in some cases. So a lot of different areas to take into account, looking at some intervention strategies too. Quite a bit of literature on just the Western diet in general, how the Western diet is not a good thing. High salty foods, eating things that disrupt the gut, eating things that disrupt the endocrine system, looking at chronic obesity problems, chronic low-grade inflammation, looking at sugar addiction too. There was one study I came across, just fascinating. I'm actually putting together a training right now for a different group on sugar addiction and the myths, facts, and controversies associated with it. A lot of controversies with sugar addiction, but there's a couple studies that have shown if they lower the sugar intake of folks that have kind of more aggressive delinquent behaviors and getting them on more of a healthy diet, they have shown an absolute reduction in some of those problematic behaviors. So I do think nutrition plays a lot into what we need to really look at in helping people succeed. Now, again, none of us are nutritionists, but maybe it's consulting with a nutritionist, hiring someone who's a nutritionist, becoming a nutritionist. There's so many things that we can do, I think, to help improve the functioning of our clients. Besides the standard CBT types of classes, which are fantastic, I don't want to minimize that. That is a big piece of the puzzle, but there are other pieces of the puzzle too. Sleep, nutrition, exercise, attachment, trauma, the list goes on. So those are a few things we could dabble in future podcasts.
For those people who are sold and want to learn more about some of the topics that we've mentioned, and I teased this earlier, why don't you go ahead and give a shout out to your excellent programs at Concordia University here in St. Paul?
You bet. So we have a couple programs at Concordia. One is a Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health. We have another emphasis area with a Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies that Joe alluded to. Both programs are fantastic. They're very multidisciplinary. We have a wonderful group of professionals that teach in the program. Some of the topics I talked about today, I'll weave in here and there. It's not the sole focus by any stretch, but you'll get introduced to some of these topics. But really understanding the multitude of factors that contribute to people engaging in problematic behavior, criminal justice involvement, forensic mental health involvement. If you're in the human service, social service arena, any of these fields, you're working with clients that are dealing with trauma histories, attachment problems, brain-based impairments. So the programs are really there to equip these professionals with increased knowledge, awareness, resources, tools, and helping instill in them that we all need to be lifelong learners. I have a lot of degrees, but I don't think I know much. The more I read, I figure there's so much more to learn. It's just unbelievable. I want to run out of things to read, and then it's never ending. So I want to take a break, but I can't. So
that is the great irony, isn't it? That the more we learn, the more I learn, at least. It's like, oh crap, there's so much I didn't know. I got to learn even more. Yeah.
Was there anything today you heard, Joe, from your criminal justice lens that stuck out to you that might be something to consider working with your clients or doing the work you do?
Yeah, just in general, I like the way you put it at one point when you referenced some of these topics as just learning other pieces of the puzzle. And I think that might be the irony, particularly while we're here in Minnesota, where we're really proud of ourselves for being progressive and knowledgeable about a lot of these things in criminal justice and human services. But in my opinion, the irony is we get so married to a particular way of thinking that, again, it becomes counterintuitive that we think that's the only, for example, pathway into or out of criminality. So a lot of the things that I personally had dismissed before as sort of what we call correctional quackery, I'm now learning, okay, it may not have been the primary pathway, but again, I think we just owe it to our clients and our stakeholders, as you said, let's learn all pieces of the puzzle. And even if we have to call in partners who are more specialized in those areas, yeah, we just have to be more open-minded. So I just love learning this kind of thing.
Appreciate you saying that. And it's a paradigm shift. I know when people hear this at first, it's like, how in the world can we tackle this? Or we don't have the credentials, competencies, the training in this. But I assure you, there are people out there that are dedicated to this and partner with them and form a team. And I truly think if you can educate your staff about these things, I do think better outcomes can happen. I'm convinced of that.
As am I, my friend. As am I. Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University in St. Paul. Also the CEO of APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. Can't wait to have you back on the show to talk more, friend.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, everyone.
Tired of those pesky risk factors? Fed up with those nagging periods of reoffending? Just can't seem to keep on the straight and narrow? Then try Criminogard. Criminogard is our patented repellent against criminogenic need. Criminogard is effective against the risk factors of delinquent past, dysfunctional family relationships, substance misuse, lack of pro-social leisure activities, deficits around education and employment, negative peers, pro-criminal attitude, and a history of antisocial personality pattern. Simply apply Criminogard at the onset of delinquent behavior or when actuarial risk assessment warrants application. Criminogard works by attacking criminogenic need at the source while buffering against future risk. Inspired by general personality and cognitive social learning theory, Criminogard identifies criminogenic need at its source. Then our top secret byproducts mimic pro-social modeling to elicit the onset of pro-social behavior. Once the cost for antisocial behavior outweighs the rewards, users begin seeing reductions in criminal deeds. Criminogard is available in regular, mint, or jasmine scent. Find Criminogard at all quality vendors, shops, and strip malls. Criminogard is not a substitute for proven evidence-based practices. Criminogard may cause mild discomfort or skin rash. In case of continued maladaptive behavior, users should subject themselves to proven core correctional practices. Criminogard has failed to result in significant effect sizes in recidivism reduction. Buyer beware, not sold in Canada. A big criminologist thank you to Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Also want to thank my musical director, Thomas Saunders, who you're listening to now, also does the introduction. And of course, my lovely daughter, Alyssa, who is the voice of the criminologist, our announcer bringing us in and taking us out of each episode. Hey, we will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, program design, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show through our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. Merchandise is available. Reach out if interested. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
If you look through a neuro, bio, psycho, social lens, you're going to be in a much better position to understand your people.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.